The morning sun blazed through the high windows of Atlanta Municipal Court, splashing long shadows across the slick hardwood floors. Judge Richard Harrison adjusted his black robe as he sank into his oxblood leather chair, steeling himself for another day of traffic tickets and misdemeanors. Age 52, graying at the temples, stark blue eyes unyielding, he was strict but fair, or so he thought of himself. The courthouse clock read 9:45 a.m. When case number 237-4 was called, Dr. Michelle Carter strode into the courtroom, posture straight and confident, though clearly in a rush. She wore a crisp white blouse under a navy blazer, with her hospital ID badge still clipped onto her pocket, an oversight on her part that Judge Harrison didn't catch. Dr. Michelle Carter to the bench for a speeding violation on Peachtree Street. The court clerk's voice echoed through the half-empty courtroom. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers. It was his third year serving on the municipal court, and traffic infractions have become commonplace. He looked at the ticket, 47 mph in a 35 mph zone issued at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Ms. Carter, he began, deliberately ignoring the doctor title. How do you plead to the charge of exceeding the speed limit? Michelle stood straight, her voice clear and professional. Your Honor, I would like to explain the circumstances. I was responding to an emergency call from the hospital. I'm a cardiac surgeon, and Miss Carter. Judge Harrison interrupted his tone, carrying a hint of impatience. A guilty or not guilty will suffice. We have a full docket today. The young police officer that had issued the ticket shifted uncomfortably behind. Michelle, you remembered that night clearly. How? Dr. Carter had showed him her hospital ID and explained about the critical patient. He had still issued the ticket, following protocol, but had noted the circumstances in his report. Not guilty, Your Honor, Michelle replied, keeping her cool. And I would appreciate being addressed as Dr. Carter. I have documentation from Grady Memorial, the hospital's confirmation of the emergency call, and Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a sharp crack. This court is not interested in excuses, Miss Carter. The speed limit exists for everyone's safety, regardless of their occupation. The fact is, you were observed traveling at 47 mph in a clearly marked 35 mph zone. A few people in the courtroom exchanged glances. Something about the judge's tone felt off, carrying an edge which seemed unnecessary for a simple traffic violation. Michelle reached into her briefcase, pulling several documents. Your Honor, if you would just review the emergency room records and the letter from the chief of surgery. That won't be necessary. Harrison cut her off again. This is a cut-and-dried case. The officer's radar gun reading is clear evidence of the violation. The police officer stepped forward. Your Honor, if I may. That won't be necessary, Officer Brooks, Harrison said firmly. He shuffled some papers on his desk, not meeting Michelle's steady gaze. Given the speed recorded and your apparent lack of remorse, Miss Carter, I'm imposing the maximum fine of $250 plus court costs. A quiet murmur went through the courtroom. Maximum fines were seldom imposed for first-time speeding tickets, particularly when there were mitigating circumstances. Michelle just stood a moment, her expression carefully controlled. She was used to this, the subtle dismissals, the deliberate ignoring of her title, assumptions made before she could fully explain herself. After 15 years as a doctor, she had thickened her skin, but there was something about this particular incident that felt different. Thank you, Your Honor, she said in a low tone, her dignity intact. I'll make sure the hospital's legal department proceeds a copy of today's proceedings. As she turned to leave, Judge Harrison was already calling the next case, having dismissed her from his mind. He didn't notice how Officer Brooks shook his head slightly, or how the court clerk frowned at her papers, or how several observers in the gallery whispered among themselves. What Judge Harrison also didn't know was that in exactly 2 weeks he would be sitting in a very different room, very different meeting, where the true impact of his actions today would become startlingly clear. But for now, he simply moved on to the next case, confident in his decision, unaware that his whole world was about to shift dramatically. 2 weeks after the courtroom incident, Judge Richard Harrison walked through the gleaming glass doors of Grady Memorial Hospital. The morning was bright, and his leather briefcase swung confidently at his side. As a member of the hospital's legal advisory board, he attended these monthly meetings regularly. But today was special. They were announcing the new chief of cardiology. The elevator carried him to the 10th, where the administrative offices of the hospital were located. Harrison nodded to a couple of faces he knew on his way to the big conference room. Inside, the room buzzed excitedly. Board members in expensive suits chatted over coughing and pastries. Their voices mixed with the rustling sound of papers being shuffled and chairs moving. "Richard, good to see you," called Dr. James Wilson, one of the CEOs of the hospital. "We got quite an announcement today." "Quite an announcement, indeed." The older man's eyes twinkled with satisfaction, like someone who knew a particularly good secret. Harrison took his usual seat near the head of the long mahogany table, opened his leather portfolio, arranged his pen just so, and settled in for what he expected to be another routine meeting. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the spectacular view of downtown Atlanta. At exactly 9 a.m., Dr. Wilson banged his gavel, calling the meeting to order. After attending to some routine business matters, he rose, smoothing his tie with a smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you are aware, we have been conducting a nationwide search for our new chief of cardiology. The candidate we've selected has an impressive track record. Graduate of Harvard Medical School, residency completed at Johns Hopkins, pioneering research in minimally invasive cardiac procedures, and an exemplary 98% success rate with emergency surgeries." Harrison nodded in approval. Sounded like the credentials were good. "Plus," Dr. Wilson added, "she's been with Grady Memorial for the past 8 years, building our cardiac unit into one of the finest in the Southeast. Please join me in welcoming our new chief of cardiology, Dr. Michelle Carter." The door opened and Harrison's world tilted sideways. In walked the same woman he'd fined 2 weeks ago, the one whose explanations had dismissed, whose title had ignored, and whose professional dignity had so carelessly disregarded. Dr. Michelle Carter strode confidently to the front of the room, her white coat pristine, her now accompanied by another one, which proved her high standing. All the blood was drained from Harrison's face as his pen fell out of his now numb fingers and rolled across the table. "Thank you, Dr. Wilson," Michelle said, her voice crystal clear and professional, the same one which had tried to explain about an emergency call in his courtroom. "I'm privileged to accept this position and excited about the future of our cardiology department." As she began outlining her vision for the department, Harrison sat frozen in his chair. Memories from the courtroom replayed in his head. How he repeatedly referred to her as Ms. Carter, how he dismissed her explanation of the emergency, how he levied the maximum fine without even looking at her documentation. The other board members were nodding energetically as Dr. Carter explained her proposals for expanding emergency cardiac care services. Harrison noticed how they spoke to her respectfully and how they leaned forward to catch her words, how they treated her like the obviously accomplished professional she was. And of course, Dr. Carter concluded, her eyes sweeping the room until they came to rest on Harrison. "I look forward to working closely with all board members, including our legal advisory team, to make sure that we provide the best care possible while following proper protocols." There was no anger in her voice, no acknowledgement, no hint of resentment. She was every inch the consummate professional. Yet Harrison felt the weight of her gaze. He managed a weak nod. His collar felt suddenly too tight as the meeting concluded and people started to gather their belongings. Harrison sat, still in shock from the enormity of what had just occurred. He sat and watched as board members approached Dr. Carter, extending congratulations, shaking her hand, and offering words of warm felicitations. Dr. Wilson approached him. "Richard, I hope you'll be working closely with Dr. Carter on the new emergency response protocols we discussed last month. Your legal expertise combined with her medical knowledge, you two, will make quite a team." Harrison nodded numbly as he watched Dr. Carter gather her papers at the front of the room. He realized with growing that this was only the beginning. They would be working in close collaboration. Perhaps for years to come, morning sun still streamed through the windows, yet somehow the room felt so much warmer than before. 3 days after the board meeting, Judge Harrison sat in his new office at Grady Memorial Hospital, reviewing legal documents with unfocused eyes. The wall clock ticked loudly in the quiet room, marking time until his first scheduled meeting with Dr. Carter. His stomach churned with anxiety, something he hadn't felt since his early days, as a knock on the door made him jump slightly. Dr. Carter entered carrying a thick folder and a laptop. Her white coat was perfectly pressed. Her expression was neutral, professional. "Good morning, Judge Harrison," she said, putting weight on his title ever so slightly. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." Harrison waved his hand toward the chair across from his desk, trying to appear composed. "Yes, Dr. Carter, please have a seat." She sat down and put her folder on the desk. "Before we discuss hospital policies, I think we should address what." Her tone was calm. A look in her eyes got serious about what happened in your courtroom. Harrison shifted in his chair. "Dr. Carter, about that day, please." She gently cut him off, opening her laptop. "Let me show you something first." She turned the screen toward him on. It played a crystal-clear video from a police dashboard camera. The timestamp showed 11:30 p.m. on the night in question. In that video, Dr. Carter's car passed at a measured pace. The radar gun reading flashed 37 miles per hour. Harrison's mouth went dry. The ticket said 47 miles per hour. "Yes, Dr. Carter finished. Officer Brooks made a towel on the ticket. He realized his mistake later that evening and tried to tell you in court, but you wouldn't let him speak." She pulled out more papers from her folder. He erased his signed statement confirming the error, along with the hospital emergency logs showing I was responding to a critical cardiac case. The silence in the room grew heavy. Harrison stared at the evidence before him, his face growing warm with shame. "Dr. Carter, he began, then stopped, unsure of what to say. "Judge Harrison," she continued, her voice still professional, but with an edge of steel. "I've been a cardiac surgeon for 15 years. I've saved hundreds of lives. That night, I was rushing to save another, a 58-year-old father of 3 who was having a massive heart attack. I made it in time barely. He's alive today." She laid out more documents. Her Harvard diploma, her Johns Hopkins residency certificates, awards for medical excellence, and letters of recommendation from some of the top surgeons in the country were all in my briefcase that day in court. She said quietly, "I try to show them to you, to explain my situation, but you wouldn't even look at them. You wouldn't even use my correct title." Harrison felt each word, as if someone had punched him in the stomach. The proof of his prejudice was laid before him in open view, not in grand acts of discrimination, but in petite dismissals, in refused opportunities to listen, and in automatic assumptions. He did not even realize that he was manufacturing the thing, is Judge Harrison. Dr. Carter continued to lean forward slightly. "It isn't about the fine, it's about something much bigger. In that courtroom, you saw what you were supposed to see, not who was actually standing in front of you." Harrison looked again at the footage of the camera on the dashboard, then at the emergency room records, then at Dr. Carter's unbelievable credentials. The weight of what he had done hit him hard. "I was wrong," he finally said, the gruffness of his voice belying emotion. "Completely wrong. Not just about the ticket, that about how I treated you. I'm deeply sorry, Dr. Carter." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, Judge Harrison. But more than your apology, I need your partnership. We have important work to do here at Grady Memorial, and we need to do it together." Taking a deep breath, she pulled out another folder. "Now, shall we discuss those emergency cardiac care protocols?" Harrison straightened in his chair, understanding the olive branch. She was extending yes. "Please, and Dr. Carter, thank you for showing me this, for making me see sometimes," she returned, opening the folder. "The hardest things to see are right in front of us. Now, about these protocols." Then, as they began their work together, something inside shifted for Harrison, a creak in the foundation of assumptions had built over decades. Outside his office window, Atlanta's skyline stretched into the distance unchanged, yet somehow different in his eyes. A month into their working relationship, Judge Harrison and Dr. Carter sat in the middle of yet another heated argument in the hospital's conference room. Papers covered the large table, and the empty coffee cups told about the duration of their meeting. "Dr. Carter, we can't just open a new cardiac care center in South Atlanta without considering the legal implications," Harrison said, running his hand through graying hair. "The paperwork alone would take months." Dr. Carter stood by the window, pointing at a mat she had pinned up on the wall. "Judge Harrison, look at these statistics. People in South Atlanta are waiting an average of 45 minutes for emergency cardiac care. That's 30 minutes longer than patients in the northern suburbs. Every minute counts in a heart attack." The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the room. as they face perhaps their greatest challenge yet. Tasked by the hospital board to improve access to emergency cardiac care in the community with the greatest need, their divergent strategies had caused them to clash. "I understand the urgency," Harrison replied, piling up another report, "but rushing into this could be more problems than solutions. We need proper permits, zoning approvals." "While we wait for permits," Dr. Carter said, cutting in, her voice firm and controlled. "People are dying. Just last week, we lost Mr. Jenkins because the ambulance couldn't get him to a cardiac center in time. He left behind 3 kids." Harrison watched her walk over to the table and pull out a patient file. Her hands shook slightly, the only indication this wasn't just another case to her. He remembered how different she had looked that day she had come to his courtroom, how much had learned since then. "Look," Dr. Carter continued, spreading out photographs of in the area, "there's an old medical building on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. It's already zoned for medical use. With some renovations, we could have you." "You've already scouted locations?" Harrison asked, surprised. "I've done more than that." She pulled out more documents, preliminary building inspections, cost estimates, and even rough floor plans. "I've been visiting these communities, talking to families, understanding their needs. This isn't about providing medical care. It is about showing these communities that their lives matter." Harrison picked so. He read his way up the building inspection report, working gingerly. He felt something shift inside as he worked with Dr. Carter. He was beginning to see beyond the rules and regulations, starting to understand the human cost and delays from every bureaucratic avenue. He would write, "The building will have to be brought into conformation significantly to the current codes of a medical facility." His tone, however, was not disapproving. It was reflective. "I know," Dr. Carter nodded. "That's why I need your help. You know the legal system, the fastest ways to get approvals. I know the medical requirements, and perhaps together we can actually save lives instead of just talking about it." Harrison stood up and walked to the map, studying the red dots that marked cardiac emergencies in the past year. They clustered heavily in South Atlanta, like drops of blood on the paper. "If we fast-track the permits," he said slowly, "and if I call in some favors at the zoning office." He turned to face her. "Would still need board approval for the budget." Dr. Carter's face brightened. "I've already prepared a cost analysis showing how the center could actually save money in the long run. Fewer ambulance diversions, better outcomes, reduced liability. You really have thought of everything, haven't you?" Harrison said, a small smile forming on his face. "I had to. Too many people are counting on this, even if they don't know it, yet they spent the next few hours working side by side, their earlier tension forgotten, as they combined their expertise." Harrison's legal knowledge helped streamline Dr. Carter's proposals, while her medical insights helped him understand the true urgency of their mission. As evening approached, they had the beginnings of a workable plan. Harrison collected his papers, struck a pose before leaving. Dr. Carter said in a low tone, "I'm glad you didn't give up after that day in court. The hospital, these communities, they need your vision." She looked up from her laptop, taken aback by his forthrightness. "They need both of us, Judge Harrison. Sometimes the most formidable barriers to break down are the ones we don't even see." He nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. As he walked to his car that evening, Harrison realized this challenging partnership was teaching him more than just hospital administration. It was teaching him to see the world and himself in a completely new way. The emergency room's double doors burst open on a rainy Tuesday evening. Paramedics rushed in with a stretcher, chiming vital signs. As they moved on the stretcher lay Senator William Brooks, one of Georgia's most influential politicians, his face gray and contorted in pain. "Cardiac arrest. Began 10 minutes ago," a paramedic called out. "Patient is 65, history of heart disease." Dr. Michelle Carter had just finished another surgery when her pager went off. She ran to the emergency room, her surgical cap still on. Judge Harrison, who had been in the hospital for a late meeting, stood near the entrance, watching the chaos unfold. "Give me an ECG, stat," Dr. Carter commanded, quickly taking charge. "Start him on." "Excuse me," interrupted a well-dressed man, pushing forward. "I'm Gregory Brooks, the senator's son. We demand Dr. Richardson. He's our family doctor." Dr. Carter continued, working her hands steady as she checked the senator's vital signs. "Dr. Richardson is at home, 30 minutes away. Your father doesn't have 30 minutes." "I'm the chief of cardiology, And I know, offense Gregory cut in his voice sharp, we prefer to wait for Dr. Richardson. He's been treating our family for 20 years. Harrison watched drive Carter's face, remain professional even as the prejudice behind the son's words hung in the air. The monitors beeped urgently, showing dangerous heart rhythms. Sir, Dr. Carter said firmly, your father is having a massive heart attack. Every minute we wait reduces his chances of survival. I performed this procedure hundreds of times. In the best your father has got right now. The senator's wife clutched her son's arm. Gregory, perhaps we should let her mom know. We don't know anything about her. How did she even become chief off? Judge Harrison stepped forward, his voice slicing through the tension. Dr. Carter is the finest cardiac surgeon in this hospital. I've seen her credentials, her success rates, and her dedication firsthand. Every second you waste questioning her qualifications is putting your father's life at risk. The monitors suddenly shrieked as the senator's heart rhythm became critical. Dr. Carter moved swiftly, ignoring the protests of the family. He's crashing. Give me a crash cart, she ordered. Judge Harrison, please escort the family to the waiting area. This is now an emergency situation. Harrison gently but firmly guided the protesting family members away. Through the window, they watched as Dr. Carter worked with incredible speed and precision, sure and practiced, charging to 300. Cleto. The senator's body jerked as the defibrillator discharged. Long seconds passed, then the miracle of miracles, a steady beat presumed on the monitor. We have rhythm. Dr. Carter announced. Get him in or prepped. He needs emergency bypass surgery. 4 hours later, Dr. Carter emerged from the operating room, tired but successful. The family stood up as she approached. Their earlier hostility had been replaced by shocked gratitude. The surgery was successful, she said professionally. We placed 3 bypasses. Your father is stable and should make a full recovery. Gregory Brooks stood awkwardly, his earlier arrogance deflated. Dr. Carter, we thank you, she nodded acknowledgement, then turned to leave. Harrison, who had stayed throughout the surgery, fell in a step beside her that was incredible. He said quietly, how do you handle the prejudice, the doubt, the constant need to prove yourself? Dr. Carter stopped walking, her exhaustion showing. For just a moment, I handle it because I have to. Because every time someone like Senator Brooks survives, it's not just a life saved, it's a mind changed. Maybe next time his family sees a black doctor. The remember tonight, Harrison reflected on his own changed views since that day in his courtroom. You changed my mind, he admitted. I didn't even realize how biased I was until you forced me to see it. A small smile touched her lips. The hardest prejudices to fight are the ones people don't even know they have. But tonight we didn't just save a senator, we saved a father, a husband. That's what matters. As they walked toward the hospital cafeteria for much-needed coffee, Harrison realized that Dr. Carter had taught him more about justice in these few months than his years on the bench. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came not from law books, but from watching someone rise above prejudice to simply do what's right. Judge Harrison sat in the back of a crowded conference room at Grady Memorial Hospital, watching Dr. Carter give a presentation about unconscious bias in medical care. It was his 3rd diversity workshop this month, but this time he wasn't there because he had to be. He wanted to learn. Even a few seconds of hesitation can cost a life, Dr. Carter explained, showing slides of emergency room statistics. When we let our assumptions affect our judgment, patients suffer. Harrison thought back to the incident with Senator Brooks 2 weeks ago. He remembered the family's instant distrust, their automatic assumption that a white male doctor would be better qualified. He also remembered his own similar assumptions from that day in his courtroom, and his face grew warm with shame. During the lunch break, he noticed something which previously would have escaped him. As Doctor walked to the coffee station, several people supply moved aside, not in respect but in discomfort. A young, white doctor grabbed the last sandwich, just as she reached for it, not even acknowledging her presence. You see it now, don't you? Said a voice beside him. Dr. Wilson, the hospital CEO, had joined him. The little things, the tiny dismissals that add up day after day. Harrison nodded slowly. I see them, because she taught me to look, but how does she handle it all with such grace? She doesn't have a choice, Dr. Wilson replied. Simply show anger, and you're aggressive, show frustration, and you're emotional. So, she excels, makes herself so outstanding that they can't ignore her. After lunch, Harrison had attended a meeting of the department heads, during which Dr. Carter presented her plans for the South Atlanta Cardiac Center. You noticed how some board members checked their phones, how others interrupted her more frequently than they did other speakers. Dr. Carter, Harrison found himself saying, after the third interruption, "Please continue your point about emergency response times is crucial." He saw her slight nod of appreciation and for the first time truly understood the importance of having allies. That evening as he walked to his car, he overheard two nurses talking near the elevator. "Did you hear they're making us take another bias training next week? I know. It's ridiculous. I treat everyone the same. This is just political correctness gone mad." Harrison paused, remembering how he used to think the same way. He believed he was fair, believed he treated everyone equally. Now he knew better. The next morning, he did something unprecedented. He requested an analysis of all of his court decisions over the past year, looking only at the fine amounts and sentencing patterns by race and gender. The results kept him in his office, staring at the numbers for hours. There was indeed a pattern. Harsher sentences for minorities, higher fines for women of color, less patience in hearing them out. He called Dr. Carter to share his findings. "I want to do better," he told her. "Not just in the hospital, but in my courtroom too. Would you be willing to review my new court procedures, help me spot where the bias could be muddling my judgment?" Pause on the other end of the line, Judge Harrison. She finally said, "Do you know how rare it is for someone in your position to even admit there might be a problem? I had a good teacher," he replied, "someone who showed me that true justice requires us to look at our own prejudices first." They agreed to meet weekly to review and revise his courtroom procedures. Harrison also started attending community meetings in South Atlanta, listening to residents' stories of their experiences with the legal system. One afternoon, as he watched Dr. Carter skillfully handle another dismissive comment from a colleague, he realized something important. Change wasn't just about attending workshops or revising procedures. It was about paying attention, speaking up, and being willing to feel uncomfortable as you confronted your own biases. "You know," Dr. Carter said to him later, as they reviewed hospital policies, "when you find me that day in court, I never imagined we'd end up here." Harrison smiled. "Truly neither did I, but for that I am truly thankful now, as the traffic ticket opened my eyes to things that I really needed to see." "The journey's not over," she reminded him. "No," he agreed, picking up another policy document, "but at least now I know I'm going in the right direction." The Atlanta Judicial Review Board meeting room was packed on this warm Thursday morning. Judges, lawyers, and court officials filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. At the podium stood Judge Harrison, his heart pounding with anticipation, his voice smooth. "I'm here today," he began, "to report a failure of justice in my own courtroom." A murmur ran through the front row of the crowd. Dr. Carter sat quietly observing as Harrison prepared to make his public admission. 3 months ago, I wrongfully found Dr. Michelle Carter, chief of cardiology at Grady Memorial Hospital, for a traffic violation she didn't commit. But the real injustice wasn't just the fine. It was my conduct, my assumptions, and my refusal to even look at the evidence she tried to present. The room had grown silent. Rarely did a judge take the bench to voluntarily admit misconduct. Particularly in this of all forums, I read through my courtroom transcripts from the last year. Harrison hit more keys and graphs appeared on the screen behind him showing how my rulings. I averaged 40% heavier fines for minorities. I cut off female defendants twice as often as I did males. I were less likely to consider explanations or reevaluate evidence when it came from people of color. Some of his fellow judges looked at their feet or squirmed in their chairs. They knew similar patterns could be found in their own courtrooms. But today, I am not here just to acknowledge these failures, Harrison said, squaring his shoulders. I am here to offer changes. He clicked to the next slide, which listed new procedures. First, required review of all fine patterns every 3 months, including breakdowns on race, gender, and economic status. Second, uniform evidence review procedures that are to be adhered to regardless of who stands before us. And third, mandatory documentation when maximum fines are issued to explain why lesser penalties are not chosen. Dr. Carter watched him cover each of his points. Clearly and confidently, this was a different man from the one who had dismissed her in court months ago. Furthermore, he continued on proposing mandatory training on unconscious bias, not just once a year but quarterly, and not just for judges but for all court personnel. A senior judge raised his hand. This sounds expensive and time-consuming, Harrison. Is it really necessary? Harrison looked at Dr. Carter briefly before responding. Let me tell you about a cardiac surgeon who was rushing to save a life. When she got a speeding ticket, let me tell you about how I refused to even look at her hospital emergency records, how I silenced a police officer who was trying to correct a clerical error, how I near let my assumptions and prejudices prevent a highly qualified doctor from doing her job. He clicked to another slide showing emergency response times in different Atlanta neighborhoods. Every delayed decision, every dismissed piece of evidence, every rushed judgment affects real lives. In my courtroom, I almost prioritize my assumptions over justice. How many times have we all done this without even realizing it? The room was silent now, his words hitting home with many present, not proud of what transpired in my courtroom that day. Harrison confessed, and trying to learn from it. Dr. Carter could have filed a complaint against me. Instead, she chose to educate me so I could see how justice looks through different eyes. He presented his last proposal, a new oversight committee including community members from every part of Atlanta to ensure diverse perspectives in judicial review processes. We call ourselves servants of justice, he concluded, but true justice requires us to first face our own prejudices. It requires us to be accountable, to be willing to change, to be brave enough to admit when we're wrong. After the meeting, as people filed out discussing the proposed changes, Dr. Carter approached him. That couldn't have been easy, she said. Harrison loosened his tie slightly. Easier than continuing to pretend I didn't have these biases, easier than letting others face the same unfair treatment. I gave you change starts with acknowledgement. She nodded. You've taken the first step many of your colleagues might follow. Looking around at the dispersing crowd, Harrison saw several judges already discussing the new proposals, some nodding thoughtfully. Maybe, he said, hopefully we can make the system just a little fairer. One courtroom at a time, one mind at a time. Dr. Carter gently corrected, just like you changed yours 1 year after the traffic court incident. Judge Harrison and Dr. Carter stood together at the grand opening of the South Atlantic. The Cardiac Care Center, a sea of people, had congregated. Hospital staff, community members, and city officials all mingled under the bright autumn Sunday. The new facility gleamed, its modern exterior, a stark contrast to the abandoned medical building it once had been. A red ribbon stretched across the entrance, waiting to be cut. Behind it, through the windows, one could see state-of-the-art cardiac equipment ready to serve a community that waited way too long for proper medical care. Hard to believe this all started with a traffic ticket. Harrison, she whispered, standing next to Dr. Carter, while they were waiting for the ceremony to begin. She smiled, smoothing her white coat. Sometimes the best changes come from the most unlikely of places. Events of the past year had changed both their lives. Courts across Atlanta have picked up judicial reforms Harrison had proposed. Bias training was now compulsory for all judges, and fine patterns would be regularly analyzed for discourses of discrimination. He had made a reputation in his courtroom for paying meticulous attention to evidence and being fair to all defendants. Dr. Carter's Cardiac Center had already saved dozens of lives during its soft opening phase. Emergency response times in South Atlanta had dropped from 45 minutes to just 12. The hospital board had even started using their partnership as a model for other departments. Mayor Johnson stepped up to the podium. Today, she announced, we celebrate more than just a new medical facility. We celebrate what can happen when people work together, when they learn from each other, when they choose to see beyond their assumptions. As the mayor spoke, Harrison glanced out at the crowd. He saw Gregory Brooks, Senator Brooks' son, by now a regular volunteer himself at the hospital. The senator, too, who, since his recovery, had become a vocal supporter of the Cardiac Center. Even Officer Brooks, author of that original traffic ticket, was present, these days a member of the police department's Community Relations Board. I'd like to invite our co-chairs, Judge Richard Harrison and Dr. Michelle Carter, to cut the ribbon. The mayor said. They came forward together, taking the big ceremonial scissors. Cameras flashing, Harrison remembered their first real conversation in his hospital office when she had shown him the dashboard camera footage. He remembered how angry and defensive he felt then, and how grateful he was now for that moment of truth. On 3, Dr. Carter said, 1, 2, 3. The ribbon fell, and applause erupted as people began touring the facility. An elderly woman approached them, her eyes welling up with tears. My Harold, she said, clutching Dr. Carter's hand. He had his heart attack last week. If the center hadn't been here. She turned to Harrison. Thank you. Both thank you for caring about our community. Later, as the crowd thinned. Harrison and Dr. Carter walked through the new facility. Each room equipped with the latest technology, each waiting area designed to be more welcoming and comfortable. The walls had hung artwork from local artists, putting touches throughout that made the space really feel like it was part of the community. You know, Harrison said, stopping by a window overlooking the neighborhood, I used to think justice was just about following the law, black and white, right and wrong. Dr. Carter joined him at the window, and now I know it's about seeing people, really seeing them, their circumstances, their challenges, their humanness. You taught me that. We taught each other. She corrected. Your willingness to change, to admit mistakes, to fight for reforms. That taught me not to give up hope for change. A code blue alarm suddenly rang through the halls. Dr. Carter straightened immediately, her professional instincts kicking in before rushing off. She turned to Harrison. Same time next week. We still have those court documentation procedures to review. He nodded. He'll bring the coffee. As he watched her hurry away to save another life, Harrison thought about how far they had come, from a mishandled traffic ticket to a partnership that was changing their city, one heart and one case at a time. Outside, the sun was setting over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the city. But inside the new cardiac center, lights blazed brightly, ready to serve all who needed help, regardless of who they were or where they came from. It was Harrison realized what justice and healing looked like when they worked together.